right, I think I would start now. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the roundtable titled Beyond the Seal, Strengthen the Accountability in Certification and Audit Schemes, co-organized by UN Human Rights, Asia Indigenous Peoples Network on Extractive Industry and Energy, Right Energy Partnership with Indigenous Peoples, Business and Human Rights Resource Center, Forest Peoples Program, and Heirich Boell Stiftung Southeast Asia. My name is Romchat from OHCHR, and it is a privilege to moderate this timely and urgent conversation. I'm asking my colleague earlier, should I be funny or be serious at this session? Because look at the name of the title, our session, Beyond the Seal. I got the question a lot, like what is the seal? Is it a mammal or animal? It's not. And no, I will not audit your coffee consumption as well. But today's session is part of the UN Regional Business and Human Rights Forum, where we are confronting a critical and often overlooked challenge, which is the accountability gap. And certification and audit scheme are increasingly positioned as safeguard for ethical and responsible business conduct. Yet, in practice, these mechanisms often fall short, especially for communities on the front line of extractive industries, agribusiness, land use change, and market-driven climate solutions. As these new certification models emerged, governing the carbon credits, biodiversity offsets, and renewable energy markets, they may look progressive on the surface, but what is the reality on the ground? So these sessions, we will explore and ask, how do we move beyond symbolic compliance toward meaningful accountability? And how do we ensure that communities and defenders are not just consult, but center in the design, implementation, and oversight of this scheme? And this roundtable is a space to share learning, honest reflection, and co-creation. So we will invite you to speak from your experience and help shape the future of the protection ground injustice, not just in the label. So we will use Mentimeter for live input, and we will flash the Mentimeter question throughout our session. But before we start, we have the honor to have Dr. Pishamon Pantong, the chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights with us. She needs no further introduction. I believe everyone knows her well. So Dr. Pishamon, please.
Thank you so much, Romchat. I hope people will know me well and know that I have a fantastic sense of humor as well. But that's me just blowing my own horn. I wanted to say this is such an important topic. It's so important because up until now, even the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights is yet to release guidance on what it means for certification audit schemes to conduct their operations in a way that is in alignment with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. It's also really important because in a meeting I had with businesses just now, so many of them were asking for certificates to prove that they've done human rights due diligence or that they are a good business that is worth associating with, so to speak. So this is a very timely topic because as we enter this kind of brave new world where there is so much uncertainty and so much desire for certainty, I think we're going to see even more demands amongst businesses for that type of, for certification, for auditing that will put minds at ease that they are in fact doing the right thing, that they are abiding by the UN Guiding Principles. The challenge, of course, is that it's not so simple. Even when it comes to certification, it is far from straightforward in relation to whether the certification is in fact in line with the guiding principles, but also are they current, as well as another question that we often hear being raised by civil society, by indigenous peoples impacted by businesses that have been certified, but which unfortunately aren't conducting human rights due diligence or abiding by free, prior, and informed consent. So there are still many known unknowns and unknown unknowns when it comes to the certification and auditing space that we hopefully will have a chance to delve into greater depth today. But what I did want to say, and this is something that these are reflections that I took away from the global convening that happened in Indonesia with Indigenous Peoples organizations precisely on this topic. And I wanted to share some of these reflections with all of you today in the hope that they can help frame some of the discussion that we'll have. The very first point is that certification, verification, audit systems must be more than just check boxes on a compliance form. A recurring concern that the working group has received and that we heard from the global convening from Indigenous representatives as well is that there is a tendency for these systems to focus on a project's technical compliance and not enough on conducting human rights due diligence. It was also noted that this issue stems in part from the fact that certification schemes often lack Indigenous peoples' involvement in governance, monitoring, and enforcement. Indeed, it's important to emphasize that while these processes can complement human rights due diligence, they should not substitute proper human rights due diligence that's meant to be ongoing, that covers actual and potential adverse human rights impacts that a business may cause or contribute to, and where all necessary and reasonable precautions are taken to prevent human rights harm. Businesses using certification, verification, or audit services should therefore ensure that they are also assessing the quality, reliability, and scope of these systems, and that they are not trying to simplify things or simply outsource their human rights responsibilities. The second observation from the global convening is that these systems need to also establish effective operational level grievance mechanisms. And this is in order to generate outcomes that respect Indigenous peoples' rights through ensuring access to effective remedies by affected peoples and communities. Certification and audit bodies are not substitutes for grievance mechanisms. If a certification or audit fails to detect harm, affected communities must still have access to effective remedies, including through both judicial and non-judicial mechanisms. And if a scheme claims to address human rights, then it should incorporate grievance mechanisms that are legitimate, accessible, and effective, consistent with the effectiveness criteria in UNGP Principle 31. Now, the third and final observation that I'll share here is that a certification label can, in fact, come at risk or at the expense of the very people that it should be safeguarding. Certifying sustainability can still result in the perpetuation of injustices. And so, therefore, certification, verification, and audit systems must recognize that respecting Indigenous rights is not an optional add-on, but is, in fact, foundational to their work. Outcomes from the global convening made it abundantly clear that in addition to Indigenous peoples' rights, free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC, Indigenous knowledge must be at the core of any certification, verification, and auditing process for projects that have potential or actual adverse human rights impacts on communities. And central to this is transparent and independent verification and auditing processes that also allow for Indigenous participation, which can help confirm whether community rights and agreements are in fact being upheld in practice and not just on paper. Obviously, a lot of this is easier said than done. And we know that it is constantly the challenge for us to move from what's on paper to realizing all of this in practice. And for this reason, verifiers and auditors should be trained not just in industry standards, but equally in human rights, as well as in Indigenous cultures and traditions, in order to ensure that they themselves are part of the, ensuring that the cultural identity of Indigenous peoples are being respected and recognized. So all in all, certifications need to stand for more than just good intentions. They must stand for more than just certifying a business so that the business can say, we're a good citizen. By embedding Indigenous peoples' rights into these systems, certification, verification, and auditing processes can contribute to advancing the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles and, crucially, to ensuring that Indigenous peoples are treated not as stakeholders on the sidelines, but as rights holders at the center. So thank you very much again for allowing the working group to be part of this important discussion. We look forward to hearing the results of the session today so that it can help inform the work that we intend to do on certification and verification going forward.
Thank you very much, Richmond. Can we have the round applause? Okay, I try to be serious. But my fellow speakers are very, very energetic and funny, so let's have the very fun discussion today. And Richmond already shared her reflection on the global convening. And as she mentioned, this is the ongoing discussion on the audit verification and audit schemes. So let's look into the detail of this global convening, as we have Robbie Halip, the Right Energy Partnership and Indigenous Peoples Executive Director, who will walk us through the background and the key findings of this global convening that Richmond just shared her reflection. Robbie, please.
Thank you, Ramchad. Okay, so last March, oh, what did I press? Okay. So last March, there was a global convening of Indigenous peoples, an initial attempt for us to gather our experiences in engaging in different certification schemes and associated auditing systems. We're actually trying to still figure out right now what would be a common term to use for this, because there are certification schemes, auditing systems, validation and verification bodies, and many other terms. No? But in the convening that was conducted last March, 32 Indigenous peoples came together from 13 countries, and they've been engaging in different certification commodities, no? From minerals and metals to palm oil, wood, pulp and paper, carbon and biodiversity credits, renewable energy, and aquaculture products. Now, in terms of the thematic areas that we looked at, we first looked at the engagement of Indigenous peoples at the governance level of the certification schemes. And so far, what we saw was that it was only in one sector in mining, with the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, where there was a strong engagement of Indigenous peoples in the decision-making body of certification schemes. We also looked at Indigenous peoples platforms that were established within these certification schemes. Again, we have the Aluminum Stewardship Initiative that has an Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum. And while it has been a forum for Indigenous peoples to gather together to discuss strengthening certification on bauxite mining and the supply chain of aluminum production, there has been also some critiques in relation to its effectiveness within that multi-stakeholder platform. From the IP platforms, we also looked at the development of performance standards, because Indigenous peoples have also been engaging in the development of these standards, particularly on human rights and Indigenous peoples' rights, ensuring that free, prior, and informed consent is integrated and that indicators are properly developed to ensure that when auditing is done, the process of free, prior, and informed consent is properly audited. Now, in our engagement, there were some performance standards that were quite strong on human rights, on Indigenous peoples' rights. But when we looked at the experience on the actual audit, it became a procedural process. It became just a tick box. And also in the actual audit, Indigenous peoples were only approached at the individual level when it's supposed to be a collective discussion that has to be done with affected Indigenous peoples when you assess free, prior, and informed consent. The other point on the audit is also auditors who are doing the audits in relation to human rights and Indigenous peoples' rights don't have that full capacity to really understand Indigenous peoples' context where they are doing the auditing. So it really comes out more as a checkbox tick box exercise. Now, when complaints are coming out in relation to those certifications, so we also looked at the grievance mechanism so far. We have not seen any good practice in relation to really providing remedy mechanisms for indigenous peoples who are affected by this certification and who have complaints on the certifications and audits that's been done in their communities. There was one instance where the affected indigenous peoples actually resorted to filing a case in the home country of one certification company, a mining company, and they won, no? So it's not just indigenous, in relation to grievance mechanism, it's not just using the grievance mechanism of certification schemes, but also looking at courts for access to justice. But then the bigger concern here also is that in many countries where the certification and audits are done, there's still that lack of legal recognition, lack of legal framework recognizing indigenous people's rights. So comes in all these voluntary standards. There's nothing at the country level that really guides how these voluntary standards are coming in and how they are being implemented within country. And through this convening, we came out with recommendations on how respect for indigenous people's rights can be strengthened within certification and audit systems. But also, we came out with recommendations to address the root causes, because it's one that you strengthen certification and audit systems. But also within businesses, there has to be systemic changes. There has to be transformations that has to be done within the operations of businesses, and for states also to ensure the recognition of indigenous people's rights within the legal system, but also putting in place an effective remedy mechanism for indigenous peoples to go to when they have complaints on these mechanisms, and that will be shared by my colleague on the recommendations that came out. But last point from my end is also the responsibility of investors and donors to not just be content with what's coming out from the certification and audits, but to also do monitoring and validation of all the certification that's being done if it really complies with international human rights standards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robbie, for grounding us in the realities and the insights that emerge from the convening. So we want to hear the recommendations and the tentative plan activities from Pravinda Chakya, the convener of Asia Indigenous Peoples Network on Extractive Industry and Energy, and the co-convening of the global convening, who will share the recommendations with us, please.
Yeah, thank you, Romchat, Zojalapa, Namaste, everyone. And as my colleague Robbie has already well explained, these 32 indigenous peoples representatives from 13 countries around the world came together to discuss various certification schemes that are impacting indigenous peoples for these different commodities, production of these different commodities, or other commodities that are coming from, that are being extracted from their lands. I should mention, besides IRMA, Indigenous Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, that Robbie already mentioned, we also discussed in depth the roundtable on sustainable palm oil, RSPO, and the new Forest Stewardship Council certificates, as well as some new certification schemes that have come about, such as the carbon credits mechanisms like Vera and architecture for RED Plus, ART as they are called. And again, based on the experiences of engagement of indigenous peoples representatives with these schemes, what we found was, while there was some important gains in the design of these schemes, of these certification schemes, general experiences are still negative. That these schemes are often only being a rubber stamp for even harmful projects. Yeah. So the question also arises, like, should we still engage with these schemes? No. And the feeling or the discussion in the room was, if we don't engage, we might just lose out on another opportunity to assert our rights. So hence, based on those discussions, and particularly given that some new schemes were coming up for even for renewable energy credits and for these carbon solutions, we came up with this declaration. But at the heart of the declaration, what we have also called on is that true recognition of indigenous people's rights must go beyond participation in these market-based schemes, but also there should be indigenous-led frameworks that truly recognize and respect indigenous sovereignty and land tenure security for any processes that affect our lands and livelihoods, so that they are accountable to us, including these certification schemes. So quickly on the recommendations. Firstly, for the states, I think these are our long-standing recommendations to the states, and these are again regardless of how these certification schemes are operated. We are calling on states to align their laws with UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and require mandatory human rights due diligence from businesses that are operating in their jurisdiction, and enforce our right to free, prior, and informed consent universally. But particularly with regards to these schemes, we are also asking states that they should also provide accountability and remedies, and hold businesses liable for violations, including clarifying the legal responsibilities of these certification schemes in promoting those human rights harms. And further, the states should at the same time promote, or more prioritizedly promote indigenous peoples-led solutions for impact assessments, renewable energy solutions, and conservation solutions for a truly just transition. To businesses, I think Pichamon has already pointed out a lot of those. Businesses, again, regardless of states' legal framework, should uphold UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and our right to free, prior, informed consent. They should conduct effective human rights due diligence and not just escape that responsibility by passing it over to a market-based certification scheme. And they more specifically, with regards to these certification schemes, they should act on violations and suspend or terminate relationship with their suppliers when they receive allegations of abuses in their supply chain. And also they should have their own grievance mechanisms, regardless of using these certification schemes. And further, more importantly, they should also have zero tolerance to any reprisals against human rights defenders that are bringing or supporting bringing allegations about harms, or supporting communities that are harmed. And finally, businesses should support ethical certification that are aligned with UN Declaration and on the rights of indigenous peoples and other human rights standards. Coming to the certification schemes, we have a list of recommendations. I won't go to all of those. I think Robbie has already touched upon some of these. Firstly, the certification schemes should ensure meaningful participation of indigenous peoples in their governance and standard setting processes. So it should not be a tokenistic representation whereby one person is invited and they adopt a standard, and the person in the governance framework of the indigenous people's representative in the governance framework of this scheme does not even have a decisive vote. That is not the way to do it anymore. We are clear on that. The certification schemes should mandate FPIC and accordingly disclose audit reports fully and accessibly to the affected communities. The certification schemes should not operate or should not certify projects that are operating or affecting isolated or indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation. They should eliminate, or particularly with regards to auditors, they should eliminate auditor conflicts whereby these auditors are hired by the businesses, and ensure independence of these auditors, and also capacity building of these auditors, particularly on indigenous rights. And they should train these auditors, these auditors on FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, and other indigenous rights. Because that is where we are seeing that indigenous peoples are getting frustrated in engaging in these auditing processes, that their FPIC are not respected, and FPIC becomes a minor violation or just a tick box exercise again. We see a lot of NGOs are promoting these certification schemes. So our other set of recommendations are to these NGOs and CSOs. We are calling on the NGOs and CSOs to engage only with those certification schemes that truly respect indigenous rights, including meaningful participation of indigenous peoples, as we stated earlier, whereby they have decisive voice. The NGOs should only promote certified projects that fully uphold indigenous people's rights and leverage these multi-stakeholder platforms, these certification schemes, to advocate for indigenous people's rights, not only within the schemes, but also with investors and buyers of these products. With UN mechanisms like the UN Working Group itself, we are calling on to the UN mechanisms to monitor these certification schemes and their auditing systems more rigorously, and recommend improvements in these schemes to strengthen the respect for indigenous people's rights in the conduct of these certification schemes. And finally, also facilitate mediation between communities, companies, and certifiers when grievances are brought up by the communities against these schemes. And this is our last set of recommendations to the investors and financial institutions that are promoting these certification schemes. What we have been calling our long-standing recommendation to these investors and financial institutions is that they need to disclose all their investments impacting indigenous peoples, including in relation to the certification schemes that are being used in those investments. They should do their own human rights due diligence and not just depend on these certification schemes or the human rights due diligence of the businesses, but do their own comprehensive and independent human rights due diligence to ensure that human rights are respected in their investments. And they should take immediate action if if violations of indigenous rights are reported in the investments, including suspending of the investments and terminating relationships with the businesses and the associated certification schemes. I hope those recommendations are useful, very useful to you. If you want to read the full declaration, please scan the QR code, and you'll get more details. I thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Pravin, for these powerful recommendations. And if you want to discuss more about the recommendation from this global convening, please come to Robbie and Pravin. I will lock them in the room so you can ask them further questions. But beyond this recommendation and the insight from the global convening, we also have the other two speakers who are here on the panel with us for the first segment, who will bring us directly to the direct experience of indigenous peoples that navigating, challenging, and reimagining market-driven accountability mechanisms. Our first speaker is Dr. June Rubis, a research fellow at Macquarie University, and she also has many engagement with many organizations. Dr. June Rubis will share reflection on the engagement on her experience on the roundtable on sustainable palm oil and how its certification process have impacted indigenous communities in Malaysia. Dr. June, please.
Thank you so much, Ramchat, and thank you to my previous speakers for laying down the ground so nicely on what happened in our global workshop in Jakarta a few months ago. We also followed up on an online workshop that was held globally, and that was really good to bring that information out. I am here to give the broad strokes around oil palm certification. I was actually inspired by a panel yesterday, if you were there, around the National Action Plan that Pitchaman was also speaking in. And I was inspired in the sense because Edmund Bond spoke about the National Action Plan from Malaysia, and he reminded, he gave and I, as a fellow Malaysian, I agree, it was an inspiring National Action Plan that looked at how we could improve better in regards of business and human rights. But as my colleague Prabind and also Pitchaman in a brilliant intervention after reminds me that we have to ground, in the end, these action plans is one thing, but we also have to ground what does it mean in practice for all of us, not just for communities, but also for businesses. So with that in mind, I wanted to talk not just about RSPO, but also MSPO, which is the Malaysian certification scheme for oil palm. And the difference is that MSPO is mandatory nationwide, which means that the Malaysian government requires all palm oil producers, including estates, independent mills, and all smallholders, both organized and independent, to be certified under the Malaysian Sustainable Palm Oil Standard, which is MSPO. When I gave my case study in Jakarta, I talked about how it was not recognized yet by the EUDR. Breaking news since I think a few days ago, on 10 September, the EU now acknowledges MSPO certification as a credible sustainability scheme with a high standard digital traceability system that can facilitate operators' compliance with the EUDR, or the EU deforestation regulation. So while that seems positive, on the surface, it doesn't appear to mean formal equivalence in the legal sense where MSPO is automatically accepted in all cases without checking. So it's more to understand that MSPO, the certification scheme, which is mandatory in Malaysia, is recognized as helpful and credible, facilitating compliance rather than guaranteeing compliance in every case. So what does this mean? In reality, there's still scope for audits, documentation, and supply chains verification. Acknowledgement does not remove all due diligence responsibilities for downstream actors, which includes EU importers and regulators. So, for example, this acknowledgement by the EUDR can emphasize, for example, facilitate compliance. So MSPO is part of the tools to meet requirements, but it does not necessarily cover all EUDR requirements in every situation, which includes certain high-risk areas or particular products with extra requirements. So perhaps one can see this recognition as part of a regulatory or political alignment rather than EU legislative act that definitely declares MSPO meeting every EU standard without further verification. So this is a good example how this certification scheme, where a market-driven accountability system can create opportunities while also revealing limits. So the EU's recent recognition of MSPO as a trusted standard for deforestation-free palm oil is an important step, and that must be recognized. And it opens up access to the EU market and signals international credibility. So MSPO is mandatory across the value chain for smallholders, including indigenous farmers, growers, mills, and processors, with an emphasis on legality, transparency, and digital traceability. So more importantly, it has a cutoff date of December 31, 2019, where any forest clearing after this date disqualifies for certification. So RSPO, in comparison, is voluntary, it's industry-led, and often criticized for weak enforcement and loopholes around deforestation. So MSPO, in comparison, it's mandatory, it's state-backed, and there's a clear deforestation baseline, which makes it stronger in some respects. So, even while MSPO strengthens Malaysia's global standing in regards to certification schemes, it also illustrates how certification schemes can unevenly burden those who are least equipped to comply, and many of whom are indigenous smallholders. So what do I mean by that? In regards of cost burdens on smallholders and marginalized groups, so certification, as you've heard, MSPO, RSPO, FSC, all such often requires audits, compliance systems, and data reporting that are expensive and bureaucratic. So large corporations can absorb these costs, while smallholders face barriers to entry or dependency on middlemen. There's power concentration in buyers and certifiers. So market standards are usually set by downstream actors, them being traders, retailers, EU regulators, certification bodies, while producers in the global south have little voice in the rule setting, yet often bear the heaviest compliance costs. So, and there's unequal benefits. Price premiums or market access tend to be captured by larger states and exporters, and they're not redistributed to small producers. So what does this result? It's, equity is entrenched, and sustainability becomes another filter for who gets to trade internationally. So this obscures environmental harm when we focus on paper compliance and not lived realities. So audit systems often emphasize on documents, traceability codes, and checklists, and this can create the appearance of sustainability while hiding land conflicts, hiding dispossession by indigenous communities or biodiversity loss. And it's selective measurements. So standards might define sustainability narrowly, for example, deforestation cutoff dates, legality, or carbon accounting, for example, while ignoring wider ecological harms such as peatland degradation, pesticide use, water contamination, or cumulative impacts of all of these. And there's greenwashing potential, as we all know. So certification labels can be leveraged in branding to reassure consumers, while structural drivers of harm, commodity expansion, monocultures, and weak enforcement on land rights continue unchecked. So finally, there are risks of relying on these systems without structural reform, and we've heard it already by my colleague Pravin. When we entrench dependency on markets, if sustainability is only validated through consumer markets, producers are forced to adapt to external priorities rather than shaping local definitions of ecological governance. Marginalizing indigenous governance, market-driven schemes rarely center indigenous territorial governance systems or customary rights. They risk erasing local stewardship traditions in favor of technocratic standards. And this weak state accountability, what happens when environmental regulation is outsourced to private standards, allowing state institutions to abdicate responsibility for enforcement, reparations, or community protections. And finally, vulnerability in the shifts in demand. If EU, the US, or even China change their sustainability rules, producers must constantly adapt with little security, and this keeps global stock producers in a reactive rather than a sovereign position. So as we can see, market-driven accountability mechanisms can provide some tools, so traceability, consumer awareness, but we need structural reform, such as secure land tenure for indigenous communities, stronger state enforcement of environmental laws, and inclusive decision-making by these communities, so that we don't risk the systems becoming tools of green capitalism, of legitimizing harmful practices, transferring costs to the vulnerable, and obscuring the root drivers of environmental destruction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, June, for these powerful and ground reflections. As June was speaking, we also show the question that we asked June as well, and we want to hear your insight on the same question. Now, next, we will hear from Robin Boell from of Pagos Trust, who will also share how indigenous communities in Sabah have led their own carbon credit certification process, which is a powerful example of how the indigenous peoples are engaged in climate actions. So, Robin, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ramchat. So, my name is Robin Boell. I come from Malaysia, Sabah, Malaysia. I work with Pagos Trust. So, our organization is an indigenous organization based in Sabah. We already work 30 years with the indigenous community. Actually, at the moment, we are not leading our own carbon credit certification, but we have involved with carbon project, first carbon project in Malaysia. So we involved with that. So the project that we involved is now is owned by the state government, our state government, the Sabah state government, and implemented by a company, Pemian Global. So as an indigenous organization based in Sabah, our role is more to ensure that the community are not left out in the project. So for today, I will share about our experience with carbon project certification to engage community in the project, and how can certification system truly include indigenous leadership and participation. So a little bit background about our project. The Common Forest Conservation Project is comprehensive initiative aimed at sustainable land use through forest conservation, promoting natural regeneration and improving livelihood opportunity for local community. In this project, there is 8 village, indigenous village involved from the Sungai indigenous tribes in Sabah. So our organization role is the project implementer partner for the community component because this project certified by BERA under the VCS and CCB. So what our role is to facilitating free prior and informed consent process in the project, and we also support livelihood program, capacity building, and community development. So our experience with community participation, actually the certification promote community involvement by ensuring FPIC and encouraging participatory decision making. This means that community are active, involved in the shaping the project and deciding how benefit are shared. For example, after we engage all the community and we finish our FPIC and the community give consent to us, so we have established a committee in each village. So the committee member can actively participate in project planning, decision making, and also the project implementation. So, and the community also participate in developing a community development plan for the project. Like the community decide what they want and what is their priority needs for their village to be put in the community development plan. The certification process also appreciate traditional knowledge and local conservation method. For example, the certification highlight the importance of recognizing this local practice, like high conservation value 5 and high conservation value 6. For example, in the project, the source of water for the gravity system and water catchment area has been recognized as community high conservation value, even this area located inside in the project area. Actually, the project area is the class 1 forest reserve, but because of the certification, this area has been recognized as community high conservation value, HCV. And the certification also require the project to demonstrate benefit sharing. Community may receive direct financial incentive and or indirect benefits such as training, employment, or improve access to resource. For this project, like I mentioned before, we have developed a community development plan as part of the benefit sharing mechanism. So this community development plan outline priority areas identified by the community, including sustainable livelihood initiative, capacity building, and social support program. So under the community development plan, at the moment the project has provided a gravity PEP system to the community, which is they don't have before. And we also do some capacity building activity like training in sustainable farming, forest management, and community organizing and leadership training and data collection training. So most of our work in the field is done by the community. We work together with them, like the forest patrolling and the data collection. So how can certification system truly include indigenous leadership and participation? This is the most important FPIC as binding practice. So the project and audit must treat FPIC as right obligation and decision making threshold. So FPIC is not only in the beginning, but it should be ongoing process and renew whenever there are changes in the activity or project, and it also must create real space for indigenous decision making on the project. The second one is every audit team should include indigenous auditor or observer. So indigenous people must be trained and recognized as part of the audit process, not just as community liaison. And indigenous representative also must sit on the audit panels and certification committee to make sure the certification is transparent with the indigenous people. And the third one is grievance mechanism must be accessible and local. So the community should not have to write email in English, because in the place most of the community they don't speak English and then understand English, or wait a month for a reply. So the community should be able to file complaint locally in their own language and expect time remedy. And indigenous representative also must sit on the grievance board, as they not just provide the input, but they also the one that responsible to make the decision making. And the last one is respect for community data sovereignty. This is very important. So the community must control how their data is collected, shared, and used, and they should have the right to withdraw consent or restrict how their knowledge is shared. And the last one, also very important in the certification, indigenous knowledge must be recognized as valid evidence in the certification. So I think, that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you
Back
very
to
much.
Robert.
Thank you very much, Ruben. So this is the first segment of our roundtable where we setting the scene on the verification and audit schemes. What is the current experience, both on impact and how Indigenous peoples really implement and engage with this scheme. As you see on the screen, we also have a lot of inputs from you. And now we will move to the next segment of our roundtable, where we'll look into more the practical steps and the insight from experts who have been working on these. So we don't have enough chair. I would love to have everyone on our speakers, but can we have the big round of applause for the first speaker the segment, please? And now I will invite the next three speakers who will share the experience and how they really engage with the business and private sector on this topic. So we have the first speaker, Dr. Unang Mokant, a senior business and human rights specialist at the Foundation for International Human Rights Reporting Standards. The second speaker is James Eckford, a business and human rights consultant at MBOT. James leads capacity building projects supporting supply chain business in Southeast Asia. And the last speaker is Walter Lin from CDEX. CDEX is a global technology company that specializes in data insight and professional service to empower supply chain sustainability. And he also has the extensive background in the field of manufacturing, international trade, and consulting. So now we will look into more practical insight of the experts who have support the business to improve the supply chain. And we have one question for all of them, which is the reflection that will look into this topic. So we will start with Dr. Unang. And I would like to hear from you, how can the certification and audit system be reimagined to embed Indigenous rights, leadership, and ensure meaningful community participation, especially where the Indigenous people's rights are at stake?
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me for this important discussion. I represent first the Foundation for International Human Rights Reporting Standards, based in Jakarta, Indonesia. While we are a civil society organization, we also work closely with government and private sector partners to advance human rights due diligence and to support Indonesia's national working group on business and human rights. In this discussion about strengthening respect for Indigenous people rights in certification and audit scheme, I would like to reflect on what we see in Indonesia's extractive sector, particularly nickel mining, which is central to the global energy transition, particularly when we use the initiative Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA, as an example. As previous speaker said, IRMA is often described as the most comprehensive mining standards with criteria on consent, cultural heritage, resettlement, and remedy. But the question is, how do we move from what looks strong on paper to what actually, work for Indigenous peoples on the ground? So, if you want certification to have meaningful beyond paperwork, it has to be designed differently. In practice, participation in mining project is often reduced to one-time meeting near the end of the process, when most decisions about explorations, permit, or infrastructure have already been made. Communities are asked to listen, but they are rarely given a real influence. In Indonesia, specifically environmental impact assessment mandate consultation, but these are often short, technical session dominated by experts. So reimagine certification would require that consultation method are chosen by communities themselves, whether through clan leaders, women assemblies, or village councils, and carry out in local languages, as a speaker said before. This would align with Irma's emphasis on culturally appropriate engagement and move beyond the one-size-fits-all approach of current audits. Indigenous leadership would be built in from the very beginning. Communities would help shape what is examined in an audit with their maps, calendars, and cultural knowledge used as a valid evidence, as not side notes. Consent would not be a single signature, but a continuing dialogue, revisited at each critical stage, when projects are designed, and then when operation expand, and when conditions change. In other words, communities should not just be consulted, they should have the tools and authority to monitor impacts themselves. Resources for monitoring would not sit only with external auditors, they would also support community members to track water quality, land access, or safety risk in real time. And when harm occurs, whether it is loss of spring, the damage of a sacred site, or a case of abuse by security forces, certification should only continue if the community itself verifies that the harm has really been addressed. When land needs to be taken for a project, the measure should not only be cash compensation, but whether livelihood are truly restored. This is what Indonesia calls a Land Acquisitions and Resettlement Action Plan, or LARAP, and it mirrors IFC Performance Standard 5. In several cases, households might receive money, but if they lose access for farming land or fishing ground, their livelihood is not restored. In many places, mining and land acquisition often divide communities. That's a real case from Indonesia as well. Those who accept compensation and those who resist. Certification audits should therefore measure impact on community cohesion, cultural continuity, and conflict dynamic. This goes beyond the technical LARAP focus on household level compensation, recognizing that displacement can erode collective identities. From my own fieldwork, 3 lessons stand out. First, when communities generate the baseline, risks are revealed that companies miss. In Sulawesi Island, for instance, indigenous map revised the boundaries of the mining area and identified footpath and spring that were invisible in the official plan. That information forced adjustment in the path plan for waste disposal to protect water sources. Second, when consent is step by step, accountability is stronger. In one human rights due diligence exercise, communities agreed to a certain condition on water and blasting schedules. Later, when contamination occurred, they posed consent until the company delivered remedy. The fact is that certification alone cannot fix power imbalance when governments or companies ignore indigenous rights. But it can set conditions. For example, IRMA indicators require FPIC and remedy. If those are not met, the certificate should be suspended. This gives CSOs leverage. A CSO can point the global standard and say, this mine cannot claim to be responsible if FPIC is missing. Third, when communities define the indicators, impact becomes visible much earlier. Instead of just measuring hectares rehabilitated, they track how long women spent fetching water and whether children were safe walking near hull or side roads. The simple indicators led to practical solution: new water kiosk or small community water station, safer crossing, reduce traffic speed, and I want to add more on the grievance system and security arrangement work much better when they are designed together with the community. In one mining site, translating grievance forms into local language and training local paralegals made the system more trusted and more widely used. There are kind of outcome IRMA envisions, but only happen when indigenous people are leading the process, not just participating at the margin. Finally, this is not about creating new standards. The framework already exists. IRMA, IFC performance standard, and even Indonesian own land acquisition law, the real issue is governance. Who define the questions, who gather the evidence, who decided when remedy is enough, and who has the authority to stop the clock. So reimagining certification in Indonesia, for instance, means moving beyond treating indigenous peoples as consultees. It means treating them as decision makers, knowledge holders, and right holders. So with authority in both project level audit and the governance of certification system, only then will certification support true procedural justice and credible respect for indigenous rights in the critical mineral sector. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Unang, for sharing the insight from the mining sector, and especially the experience from Indonesia. If you attend a session in the morning beyond extractions, Indonesia is the global hotspot for the critical energy transition mineral like nickel and mining. So this is very, very insightful. Next, I want to hear from James. In your experience engaging with the business, what are the gaps that you see in the system and how can it be redesigned? Thank you.
Thank you, Robchat. So my name is James. I'm with Embode, independent human rights consulting agency. And so we mainly work with, large multinational brands on strengthening their HRDD systems. And that also means working with their tier 1 suppliers. I will admit I'm not exactly an expert when it comes to indigenous rights or certification mechanisms. Most of our work does kind of focus on labor rights. But I've attended another session yesterday, and I read the global convening paper, so I did my homework before. But I can see there's a lot of parallels when it comes to labor rights. We're talking about loss of trust in certification mechanisms, lack of representation of the impacted stakeholders, and lack of involvement in the kind of governance systems to instill accountability and trust in these systems. So, but also through our work on human rights impact assessments, we've seen instances where indigenous rights do come up, and we can see kind of the issues that come with this. Well, I think when it comes to reimagining certification mechanisms, if we kind of go back to the original purpose, and I think taking from the language used in the global convening paper, it's to be used as a badge of honor for the businesses. It's exactly, literally rubber stamping something they can have on their products, something the consumer can see. So from the very beginning, compliance is kind of baked in, and this kind of compliance-based approach, it's something that comes up a lot today, and I think also in the labor rights space, that we're not really satisfied with. We're seeing that it's not as effective. Well, it wasn't effective in the beginning, but this was something that often came even before the UNGPs. And when we work with these businesses, we approach businesses as a system, and we understand that a business is made up of different departments. And so the ones that we're usually working with is the sustainability or human rights department, and they themselves are very aware of these limitations. And the ones who may be using the certification as kind of a badge of honor will be a different department, and they might be the ones saying, this is good enough, we don't need to go any further. How much further do you want us to go? This isn't reasonable for us. So when we speak to the human rights people, and they often come from the same background as we do, there may be a department of just 5 people or 10 people, but we kind of recognize that they're working in a difficult space. And they'll be the ones who will come to these sessions, and they'll be aware of grievance mechanisms and certification mechanisms needing to be more effective and equitable and inclusive. And it's usually these kind of brands that approach Embode in the first place, because the question is, how exactly do we do this? How do we go beyond auditing? As we say, it's difficult enough for them when it comes to just even labor issues in tier 1 and 2, but when it comes to indigenous rights, land rights, which is something that's happening, maybe tier 3 or 4, it's something that is much more complicated. A lot of complex historical, socioeconomic factors to look into. And the biggest question is how far does our responsibility go? And for a lot of them, they want it to stop having the certification. But obviously, there's a lot of risk when it comes to different commodities, a lot of different geographies, a lot of things to different kind of unpack. And even though the UNGPs, can give a good theoretical grounding, a good starting point for answering those questions, but the reality is much more complex. And especially when if you're trying to use cause, contribute, directly linked, it still doesn't truly answer just how far should you go. So, just think about these schemes and trying to kind of connect responsibility across the supply chain, to have shared responsibility, and not just saying the brand has done its job by saying we've checked the supplier has the certification so we can go, and then the next supplier says this one has certification, okay, that's all we need to do. But you need to have, shared responsibility rather than just having this compliance exercise, and recognize that the certification mechanisms are essentially acting on behalf of the businesses, because the businesses can't do everything. And they may get the impression, when we're coming to them and saying, you have this responsibility to do this, they'll say, oh, but we're not the only business here. There's lots of other brands, we have lots of suppliers throughout the supply chain. How do we share this across the supply chain to make it, efficient and collaborative? So, you need to be aware of the shortcomings of those auditing schemes, but then it's where do you kind of start? So I think one thing to start with is just having the visibility. So, we've said, and one of the things that came out in the global community paper was the lack of understanding of the auditors of the communities. But this also then stretches back to, the businesses themselves. The businesses also need to have that visibility. Going back to the brands, if they are sourcing from a high-risk area where there is known to be land grabbing or infringement on Indigenous rights, they need to be aware of this, and they need to kind of start from the very beginning of their own HRDD processes when they're doing, for example, a human rights impact assessment. So they need to be able to carry this out. They need to really understand the context, understand what rights are at stake, understand how different Indigenous rights may be to labour rights, because they may be very well versed in labour rights, again in the kind of tier 1 or tier 2 supply chain, but it comes to Indigenous rights, there's obviously a lot more to unpack. And of course then the human rights impact assessment itself needs to be very well grounded. There needs to be meaningful engagement with stakeholders. You need to be well informed before carrying out. You need to look at what are the strength of governance and judicial systems in that country. Look at the extent of marginalization, the history of marginalization of Indigenous peoples in that country. And again, this is of course one of those things that small team of 10 people in a brand cannot do this. It's one of those things that gets outsourced, usually to a company like Embode. Not that I'm trying to sell it here. But meaningful engagement has to be at the heart. It has to be starting from that very, beginning. Because if it's not there at the start, then it won't be at any other stage in the process. And you have to, approach this kind of mind of inquiry rather than going, oh, we need to get FPIC. That's the goal that we have to get. So let's find a way around. And I remember speaking on a panel with Robbie before and just saying that, some brands may hire a consulting firm to approach a community to just sell the project to them and say, oh, these are all the benefits you can get out of it. But this is obviously a very extractive approach. And it's not starting from the right kind of frame of mind, the right perspective. So, and I think as a lot of other colleagues have been saying about, each of these entities needs to do their own due diligence of the mechanisms as well. You need to look at the certification mechanism. And obviously the global convening paper, where I was reading it, it's done a lot of that work for you. It's got all the different, it looks into, the different aspects of those mechanisms and how well Indigenous people are included in the governance of the mechanisms. How effective is the FPIC? How effective is grievance mechanisms? What is their approach to human rights defenders? So a lot of literature and knowledge, it already exists, and this is where you need to also have, collaboration with civil society, and look at where those certification mechanisms, don't do so well. You need to also look at your suppliers. What kind of grievance mechanisms, what processes do they have? What due diligence do they have in place? And then of course you also have to, that's the point of looking at, you have to recognize that these kind of schemes, they're just one tool in the overall toolkit and that they have their limitations. And obviously one really significant limitation, again, that came out of the global convening paper and has been mentioned a lot, is, the approach to FPIC is simply a box-ticking exercise. And I think there is, again, it's a thing we see in labour rights as well, as this tendency that the minute you kind of have a requirement, which, it came with good intentions to safeguard rights, but it ends up being seen as an obstacle to be overcome, rather than looking at what was its actual intention, which was to have accountability to Indigenous people and sovereignty over their land. So therefore, also requiring suppliers to have certification, that's also just one part of the HRDD work. And you need to go beyond, again, when you're handing down these requirements, throughout the supply chain, it can't just be, here's a requirement, you need to go fulfill it. There also needs to be, capacity building of the suppliers. And again, when we're talking about businesses, we had the recommendations for the businesses before, but recognizing all the different types of businesses. The brand will sit at one end and will have, the least kind of knowledge perhaps and be, very far in terms of proximity, but they may have the greatest leverage or greatest capacity, but they also might not. There might be agro traders in the middle, the very big companies they're not very public facing, but they might have the most leverage. Also needs to be, capacity building of their staff, and then also going down the supply chain to have an understanding of Indigenous rights again, because when we're talking about the auditors and certification bodies having that understanding, that also needs to start throughout the supply chain, so that when FPIC is started as a process, that it started with the right mindset, that it is about accountability to Indigenous people and not just something that you have to get in order to start your project. I'd say the buyers also need to have this kind of their own capacity building, because as I say, we're talking about often a very small human rights team who is going up against other departments who may want to say, oh, this certification system is good enough, why do we need to go for any other? And you have the human rights person listing all the problems with it, but then they also need solutions. Okay, but practically, what do we actually do? So it's just understanding, there's a whole kind of ecosystem to engage with to realize and protect Indigenous people's rights. And I'll just finish up because I'm being told I'm going on a bit. And I think it's just one last thing. So businesses also shouldn't be afraid, I think, to demand better from these schemes, because they are relying on these schemes at the end of the day to say, our trust, the trust that the consumers have in us, and then the brands have the trust in the suppliers. It's all coming down to the certification schemes, and they have to demand better. So I think a lot of the different things which my colleagues have said about it, certification schemes being Indigenous-led, having them involved in governance, protection of human rights to vendors, all these different kind of things, the brands and the different suppliers throughout the supply chain all need to be demanding this from the certification schemes. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, James, for sharing the insight from the industries. Really insight. Then the last but not least speaker on the panel, Walter Lin from CEDEX. You have 20 years experience in supply chain management. So what is your reflection or any recommendation to redesign the scheme?
Okay, thank you. So first of all, I'd like to pass my thanks to my friend Robbie to invite me to the panel session. First of all, as probably you know, we are like a private sector membership organization to support the human rights due diligence. We have 90,000 members globally. And I think one of the reflection, I think James shared quite a lot insight from the private sector, but maybe I raise one question for everyone to think about. For all these certification program, audit program, who designed the program? Who is the most beneficial party? Is the community, is the workers, or is the brand itself? I think that's the first question we need to think about. From my personal perspective, not on behalf of CEDEX, I personal thinking a lot of certification program are designed just to support the investor, brand, and retailers to reduce their brand reputations. If this is the intention we design this program, then how can we put human rights in the center of the assessment program? I know we talk about lots of practical things, engaging, but in that mindset, if I can take auditing program is something like a baby, but there is no this DNA when they were spawned. How can this baby to grow something you expect? So I would like to say all these certification program, even for us, we do have our social audit program for labor right, but it was designed by brands and retailers, investors from the beginning, even nowadays. But there is no any engagement consultation with the people, the workers, women's, children's. And then how can you respect the program can really, truly respect human rights, including the people in the community? And also, I think we need to really think about when the DNA, we need to restructure the DNA rather than reimagine. I think that's my personal observation. Secondly, you're talking about the people's right, enjoying people's right. I guess from a business perspective, how much awareness they have. For example, if I'm the people from the private sector, a brand, I see child labor's plantation from the news. It's not too much related to me, right? I got awareness, but I don't think it's too much related to me. But how much related to my business? Because as Jane mentioned, as a brand, you can reach to first-tier supply manufacturers. But the plantation or palm oil is too far away. Even they know it's a problem, but how much the risk associated to me as a brand? I think there is a gap in here. So awareness raising is not about how much this is important, but how much is important related to my business. As a business, we need to think about the reputation. So I think we need to have this mindset changing. Then I think the practical challenges, I got that is important. I see there is a risk in the up tier of the supply chain. But then another practical problem is how can I engage with the community? Because I talked to June just now talking about you got thousands, hundreds community globally. And as a brand, how can I reach them? Who is the organization can be a one central place I can reach out to? And second, how can I get help? Because I know it's important, but who can help? There are so many NGO community in the ground who I can reach. And this is a very practical challenges. And then we talk about auditors, about auditing program, a lot of very good idea. We have discussion just now. But I think I just would like to pause for now, just to raise awareness why it's important, whether there is a DNA in there. If there is no DNA, nothing will be happened. So I will pause for now. Thank you.
Very wonderful reflection. We have to think about the DNA. Now I would like to open the floor for your reflections or questions, since we have all the experts, especially experts and, on the table now to engage with the business. Or even if you have the question for Robbie, Praveen, June, and Robin, you can ask the question as well. Yes, please, the gentleman over there. Yes.
Hi, thank you to all the speakers. So I think June's talk seemed to identify like a core tension between the promise of these market-led voluntary mechanisms and coming a little bit closer to what you were suggesting, Walter, around this issue of, what the DNA does and who it benefits. And I mean, the whole idea was that you can have voluntary markets of guarantors of a green transition that is people-friendly. But then you have against that this idea that a truly indigenous first mechanism would have to be compliance oriented. But at the heart of this, from let's say I'm from Pakistan, working closely with communities that suffer from green transition related mechanisms as well as legacy market frameworks and so on. And going to the question of climate finance, which is at the heart of the indigenous as the steward debate, whether it is forest mechanism, whether it's renewable energy credit, whether it's carbon credits and so on. The whole idea there is that you need to draw in, I'm not necessarily suggesting we should be doing that, but we need to draw in private finance. And the only way to do that is if you make it, healthy enough and worthwhile enough to be able to invest in that way. And that's the whole promise of the voluntary market. That's the whole promise of securitizing things like REC and carbon credits. That's the whole idea of allowing for derivatives of this markets and even going into blockchain and so on. Now, my question is that for us, I think as a panel that seems to have combined these two issues, and I'm not sure if this is a combination that really makes sense unless we can actually solve this core issue, which is which of the two approaches, and if neither, then what is the third? And I haven't heard a real challenge, taking the challenge head on, especially if the question of the limitation of a market-led solution, which came out of June's talk, is put at the centerfold of that particular question. So it's an open question to anyone who was on those very numerous number of people.
Okay, take another two questions because colleagues from the next session is already in the room, so we have to wrap up soon. So maybe our friend Serti over there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ramchat. My question is, does the certification can protect the land or indigenous territories and indigenous people's rights after?
Okay, and last question. Yes, please.
Hi, so actually I would like to pose Walter's question to the panel. So what is the business case for doing supply chain audits, and how can businesses extract value beyond compliance from such audit results?
Last question, please.
Yeah, I am Zubair Torwali from Swat, Pakistan. So I will make an ask and a comment. Having my experience with the world biggest financing institution like ADB and World Bank, what I have learned that they value the country laws and making it an excuse to absolve it from the indigenous rights or human rights issues involving in a particular project they have been doing. And the ask is that I have been engaged with the World Bank on a few hydropower projects in my Swat Valley. And now I am stuck. They are not moving forward with any meaningful consultation, and they are pushing me towards the government under the bus. I mean, under the bus to the government, because our governments are a little bit more oppressive than those institutions. So I need help of this United Nations Forum and many other forums, how to go forward. And Zain is my friend. He is there. They are supporting us. But I am now stuck. I was, before coming to this session, I was a little bit late because I got an email from the World Bank, a very frustrating email, and I could not respond to that. So I need really what to do now.
Speakers, would you like to respond? Maybe water?
I think someone asking a question of why the business case for we need to do a supply chain assessment and audit. I think from my personal view, again, honestly, I think it's more about brand reputation. If you don't let, you lose the money, you lose the brand reputation. But maybe my add-on question is how that truly to respect the human right is a question to everyone to really to think about, because we always talked about, oh, we need to do everything. Is it benefit really for the community or is benefit for the brand itself? So it's an open, challenging question for everyone to think about. Thank you.
I got the signal that we have to wrap up, but I will give the last word to Praveen, who would like to share the reflection.
Yeah, I think I just would like to, kind of not end this, let's say, as Jane already said, like, a discussion whereby we are discussing two different sides of the of these certification schemes on a negative tone. I think I should just say that with certain certification schemes we are also making progress. I would definitely mention here IRMA, Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, whereby the governance model, the standard setting, the meaningful participation of indigenous peoples, we are achieving what we are trying to get there, in terms of meaningful participation in the governance, in terms of meaningful respect of our EPIC in IRMA assurance practice. However, what we are also still seeing in IRMA's assurance processes is also that the implementation is not meeting the standards or the the governance model that we have. And I think that there lies the problem that all of these schemes or processes are market-based approaches. And that is where, again, this was a very big debate in the global convening too. Should we even engage in these processes, or should we even engage in these market-based processes? And that is where, again, as we also shared in from the declaration itself, that we are calling that we want to move beyond market-based solutions. We want to move to an approach which is more ethical, more human rights-based, and it is indigenous-led framework based on our sovereignty that puts that centers the rights of indigenous peoples and led by with a process led by indigenous peoples itself, even in the implementation. I think I'll just stop there for now.
Thank you, Les Praveen. And I think what my key takeaway is that this topic is still need the ongoing discussion, and both from the indigenous peoples community and individual side, and also from the market and the business side as well. So I'm glad that we start this conversation here today at this forum, and clearly that we have to continue working and engaging together. On the screen you see the partner organization, and we are here, available here in this forum to discuss this topic further. So reach out to us, here our speakers who will be in this forum for further questions or further discussion, if you want to ask further about the DNA or any interesting question that for the business to start asking and checking themselves. So thanks a lot for joining our session today, and thanks for the organizer and speakers for making this session happen, and let's continue in touch. Thank you.